pretend. The smiles, the lies, the perfect end. The world's a stage, they run the flow. You clap on cue down in the front row. Final shade.
Hello, hello. So there's a book Hollywood wants us to forget. Not because it's perfect and not because it's accurate in every detail, but because it's broke something Hollywood depends on, which is the illusion, right? When we think of Hollywood, we think of this grandiose illusion, so to speak. Hollywood Babylon was banned, mocked, and dismissed as trash, yet for decades it was passed from hand to hand, whispered about, photocopied, smuggled across borders. And this episode is not believing everything that is in this book, right? That's not what this podcast is about. Don't believe everything that you read, see, or hear, right? It's about critical thinking and breaking the system. And it's also about asking a more dangerous question. Why did Hollywood work so hard to make sure you believed that none of the book was real? Because when we strip away the myth, the glamour, the spotlights, what's left is a system that learned very early how to control narratives, how to buy scandals, and how to protect profits at almost any human cost. And so this is a history of Hollywood before it learned how to clean itself up, which I don't necessarily believe that Hollywood has ever cleaned itself up. I think it's just changed and put on a new mask, depending on what decade it is. And the systems it built to make sure that you, the consumer, never saw the mess that was behind the curtain, so to speak. But before we jump into that, let's look at Hollywood itself. Hollywood was founded as a real estate subdivision in 1887 by, I believe it was Harvey Henry Wilcox, and was later incorporated as an independent city in 1903 before it eventually merged with Los Angeles in 1910 because of subdivision layout. They wanted the benefits of sewer and water and things like that that kind of went along with what Los Angeles was offering. Okay, so that's kind of like a little bit of background about where Hollywood initially started. Okay, and it was also started as like a Christian community back in the day. Okay, and it was very short-lived, and it changed pretty rapidly. So the guy that wrote this book, Kenneth anger. And the whole idea of the book is that he exaggerated, he lied in certain places, he sensationalized things, but he might have exposed a pattern and not necessarily a ledger. Okay? So Hollywood did not begin as an empire. It began as an escape. And in the early 1900s, film companies fled New York, not for sunshine or palm trees, but to get away from Thomas Edison. Edison controlled key motion picture patents and aggressively sued competitors. And if you really look into Edison, like Edison is a really neat rabbit hole to go down in itself, because the guy would do this with any of his competitors. He would go out of his way to go after his competitors at every chance that he got. And so the idea was that California was far enough away from Edison and the motion picture industry during that time period. Law enforcement there was also pretty loose. The court systems were slow and the rules were kind of flexible. So Hollywood became a frontier town. There were no unions, there were no labor protections, there was no child actor laws, no moral oversight, and the studios basically owned everything at that time period. They owned your image, your schedule, your public life, and sometimes your private life too. Actors, especially women and children, were bound by contracts that gave studios almost near total control. And from the beginning, something was clear, that Hollywood learned how to exploit people before it learned how to protect them. Okay? So let's go through some more history here. So there were some scandals, and that's kind of what this book is about. It's about some different scandals that happened during these different time periods. So there was a scandal that nearly ended the whole Hollywood industry from 1920 to 1922. So by the early 1920s, Hollywood's secret life was leaking and America was watching. So we turn to the Fatty Arbuckle scandal. So in 1921, one of the biggest stars in the world, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, was accused of raping and killing a young woman. And there were 3 trials that followed. 3. And he was acquitted. The jury even issued a formal apology, but it didn't matter because the damage was already done. And just like they do nowadays, newspapers sensationalized the case. And the moral outrage exploded. And Hollywood itself suddenly looked dangerous. And Arbuckle himself, his career never recovered. So truth had become irrelevant, and the idea of perception was everything. Okay? Then we turn to William Desmond Taylor and that murder. So 1 year later, director William Desmond Taylor was found dead, shot in his own home. And the case was filled with things like missing evidence, disappearing suspects, and studio pressure, and a media blackout that followed almost immediately. Now, I want you to pay attention to some of these ideas, facts, and statistics and things that we're going over. And does a multitude of these things sound familiar? Do they sound relevant? Do they sound up to date, or what's been happening, or what has happened recently? Okay? And so the idea here was that the murder was never solved, and it never needed to be. What mattered was the message that Hollywood was losing control of its image, and that was unacceptable. Okay? So then we go from the 1920s to the 1930s, and we look at a little thing called the Fixers. Hollywood's response was not reform, it was infrastructure. So studios hired these fixers. So studios hired fixers, and these were men whose job was not to create movies, but to erase them. And how did they do this? Well, they bribed police, they paid off reporters, they arranged marriages, they covered up overdoses. Yes, overdoses were happening then too. They silenced the victims, and they made people disappear quickly. Eddie Mannix of MGM became infamous for this role, though he was never alone. And this was not conspiracy, this was payroll. Hollywood invented modern crisis PR decades before, yes, corporations. Before corporations, basically took it over and gave it its name. And all of these things really worked. Scandals, they still happened, but the public never saw the pattern. And so now we jump into the Hays Code. So by the 1930s, public outrage forced Hollywood to act, at least publicly. And so the Hays Code was introduced. And so this code had strict rules about sex, crime, language, morality. So on screen, Hollywood became this puritanical thing, okay? But off screen, really nothing changed. And so the code itself was never about ethics. What was it about? Well, what is the system really good at doing? It's about control, right? Because if Hollywood could regulate itself, then the government wouldn't have to, right? Same thing about you and I. If you and I could regulate ourselves, the government would never need to step in, and there would never be any new laws to be wrote in the books. Okay? Think about that. So the clearer the image became, the darker the reality grew behind it. And now we jump into when Hollywood Babylon was wrote, and it was wrote between the 1950s and the 1960s. Okay? So decades later, this guy named Kenneth Anger, he published Hollywood Babylon. And the book itself, it was chaotic, it was sensational, it was unapologetic. And some stories were exaggerated and some were unverifiable, which means still to this day we can't tell if it was real or if it was fake, if it was staged, what was it. And some of these stories were just plain wrong, but many quietly were true, or parts of them were true, right? And so what happened next? Well, the book was banned in the United States due to libel concerns, and so it circulated underground, and Hollywood dismissed it as just pure filth, right? That's the kettle calling itself black there, right? Yet they never systematically disproved it at all, because to do so, they would have to open files that they'd worked decades to either destroy or to hide. Okay? So Hollywood Babylon mattered not because it was flawless, but because it shattered silence. It suggested that the scandals weren't isolated, that they were structural. So decades passed, and slowly the truth caught up, and in an actor's memoirs and court documents and in an archived studio records, they confirmed that some of these things were happening. So what did they confirm? Well, that there were studio cover-ups, that the studios did forced image control, that there was sexual exploitation happening, that drug dependency was hidden for plain profit by these corporations, and mental breakdowns were reframed as eccentric geniuses. Okay, so Hollywood Babylon, the book, hadn't invented darkness. It just named it early on. Okay, so that's what the book got right. But what did the book get wrong? So like we've talked about, some deaths were sensationalized. Some violence was exaggerated, right? It is a book. It is Hollywood, okay? And some rumors were treated as just plain fact. And this matters, because separating truth from myth makes the truth stronger, not weaker. And you can apply that to anything, right? Especially when we're trying to break the system, when we're trying to look for truth. Finding truth matters, okay? So Hollywood used the book's flaws as a shield. So if some parts were wrong, then it could all be dismissed, right? Because that's how court systems work. And that strategy worked for a while until history began confirming the pattern. And so now we look into the modern echo. And after this, we're going to look at some things here. So we fast forward to recent times. And how does recent times play into what was happening before the book was wrote, and when the book was wrote, and shortly after the book was wrote? Well, look at Harvey Weinstein, right? Look at things called NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. Like, why do we need those, right? We've had child stars that broke down publicly. They had the invention of conservatorships, image laundering through PR, to make people look good or to make people look bad, depending on what these individuals or places, companies were trying to do. So the names changed, but the system didn't. Hollywood didn't stop abusing power. It just simply got better lawyers, right? They just got smarter, okay? So Hollywood Babylon, the book, wasn't a lie. It was a leak from an industry that learned very early that controlling the story mattered more than confronting the truth. And so now we also need to look at other things, like politics, right? If an idea works for so long, don't you think that other companies and other businesses and other places and other people are going to take that idea and they're going to extrapolate upon that? They're going to use some of those little nuances throughout, right? So look at politics, right? Politics is just one big, never-ending Hollywood story, right? Where it's one side versus the other side, and we're caught in the middle, and we'll never break free because we're too busy arguing with ourselves to see what the real truth is, right? So this episode isn't about nostalgia for scandal. It's about understanding how systems protect themselves. Because once you see the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. And that really is the scariest part. Is, like we said, this wasn't just Hollywood. It's that Hollywood taught the world how to do these things and how to be successful in these things. Okay? So let's look at Hollywood deaths that echo themes from the book. So the template here is, or the book established a template more than a factual record. Okay, you've got sudden fame turns into isolation, isolation turns into addiction, addiction turns into secrecy, secrecy turns into institutional cover-ups, and then at the end, bum bum bum, early death, right? Okay. So many years later, after this book was wrote. We have Marilyn Monroe, 1962, and why this fits the Babylon archetype. Extreme studio control over image and behavior. Okay. We have documented drug dependency, which came in the form of barbiturates, conflicting official narratives around her death, missing evidence, altered timelines, sealed records. Okay. So what's real? Well, she died of a barbiturate overdose, ruled probable suicide, quote unquote, right? She was medically overprescribed and emotionally isolated. Sounds a lot like some other Hollywoods or, actors and actresses recently. So the Babylon myth, or Babylon style myth here, is that affairs with powerful men, which she did have, there was suppression of information, and Hollywood was trying to protect itself. So whether conspiracy or not, her death cemented the idea that Hollywood destroys what it creates. Now we look at James Dean, 1955. And what is his theme, or what does he symbolize? Well, youth, speed. Okay. He died at 24 in a car crash. Sounds a lot like Paul Walker. Also look into what Paul Walker was doing shortly before his death. Right? Supposedly he was trying to uncover, or was going to uncover, a massive child pedophilia ring. Right? So we jump back to James Dean. He only starred in 3 major films. He was instantly mythologized, so in mythology. So Dean becomes this clean version of Babylon. No scandal needed, and Hollywood turned death itself into branding, right? So they basically branded this guy because of the way that he died and the actor that he was. Then we jump to 1969. We got Judy Garland. And so the theme on this one was that it was a studio manufactured addiction, right? So the studio had given her barbiturates and amphetamines as a teenager that helped control weight. They controlled her sleep, and it controlled her behavior. And so that created a lifetime dependency for her, created by the system. And if we look into the cause of death, it says accidental, once again, because of an overdose from barbiturates. And so this really is one of the clearest documented cases where the studio system directly engineered a fatal trajectory, right? Nobody stepped in. Nobody said, hey, stop. We've got to help this young lady. She's on the wrong road and the wrong path in life. She's doing these things. We need to get her help. And so her death really was led by the studios. River Phoenix, 1993. Child actor, addiction hidden until it wasn't, and when it wasn't, it was public, right? Died on the sidewalk outside the Viper Room. And so the idea here is that unlike early Hollywood, this death happened in public, but the pattern was identical, right? We have fame, then we have pressure, and plus access, plus silence, and all of these things equal this tragedy, okay? We jump ahead again to, well, so we're going to go over both of these because they only happened a year apart, right? Both of these, what my generation would consider very recently. 2008 with Heath Ledger and 2009 with Brittany Murphy. So Ledger, he was method acting plus pharmaceutical cocktails, led to an accidental overdose, multiple prescriptions from different doctors, okay, which should automatically be a red flag for anybody. we look into the industry tendency to frame death as artistic intensity, right? And that's that method acting that Ledger was so famous for. So again, no murder, but a systemic failure dressed up again as a tragedy. And then Brittany Murphy, there were conflicting explanations and it was confusing, right? She was 32, it was a sudden death, possibly from mold, from pneumonia, from prescription drugs. And what was weird about this one was that the husband dies under similar circumstances months later. And so this one, there was a lack of clarity, strange coincidences, and the media spin on things, right? And because of the way that the media spins things nowadays, it gave it this very Babylon-esque, even if no conspiracy was ever proven, right? So why does Hollywood ever even exist at all? Hollywood itself wasn't founded for glamour like we talked about. It was found to basically get away from Edison and to escape law enforcement. Let me move this over. And like we talked about, Edison's problem was that he wanted to control everything. And so for him, it was all about patents. He wanted to control the early film patents. And if you were an independent filmmaker, you were sued, you were shut down, you were assaulted by these random enforcers that would show up sometimes. There might be these weird, crazy mishaps with equipment that just like malfunctioned and seized up, and you know. So like we talked about, filmmakers fled as far away from New York and New Jersey as possible. Get as far away from Edison as they possibly could, because during that time period, California, land was cheap, had reliable sunlight, had easy access to Mexico if these people needed to flee. So Hollywood was literally built by patent dodgers and legal fugitives. But when we look into the early studios, they weren't clean businesses at all. Early studio heads were often former garment traders, carnival operators, theater hustlers, immigrants locked out of elite institutions. And that's kind of like where the book really plays into, in that it plays on that Hollywood is built around this dark image, almost cult-like, and that they could play out these realistic blood rituals that before this they had to do in the dark, so to speak. But now they could do these things, right? And you think of scary movies, they could do these blood rituals, or just these rituals in general in the public's eye. And not only that, the public, us, the consumers, we would pay to see these things, and we would pay good money. So they created this vertical monopoly where they controlled production, they controlled the distribution, the theaters, the publicity, and they even controlled the stars' personal lives. So this was quote-unquote capitalism without any guardrails, so to speak. And if you were a star, this system was a control system. The studios changed actresses' names. They hid ethnic origins. They forced things like abortions. They covered up crimes. They dictated marriages and divorces. And they used morality clauses to punish dissent. Actors were assets, not people. Okay? And if an asset broke code or rules or whatever, they were discharged or chemically managed or quietly erased, right? Think about that. Chemically managed, what does that mean? Think about all of these actors and actresses that we just talked about that died from drug overdoses, or that were on multiple prescription pills given by multiple different doctors, right? And if you or I were to do those things, that would be a red flag. Like, the doctor would red flag that. Rules for thee, but not for me, so to speak, right? I like that saying. So that's the moral core of Hollywood Babylon. And so the book there, the book is not wrong about those things. So why the scandal mattered? So the scandal was a marketing tool, a warning to other actors, and a pressure release valve, right? So, and I still think that actors and actresses today, they do need to have like this moral code warning, like, hey, if you're about to be an actor or actress, you should have some really good friends around you. You need to have a just in case of something in your pocket, so to speak, to protect you from just the visceral damage that can happen from these people. Okay. So studios leaked some stories while they buried others, and the public got just enough truth to stay fascinated by the story or the individual, but not enough truth was ever released so that we or the police or the court system would demand some type of reform, right? And once again, all of these little things that we're talking about, think about other places, other systems where these things fit, okay? Politics, school system, unions, corporations, right? And they're there, right? Just like history repeats itself, these little nuances repeat themselves all throughout society. A lot of times we don't pay any attention to it, okay, until it's too late, okay? So Kenneth Anger exaggerated, and he lied in places, and he sensationalized, right? We've said that. But he exposed a pattern and not a ledger, okay? And so just like with anything else that we've talked about on this series, is that the big thing that I urge people to do is to become critical thinkers. And you have to ask questions. You always have to ask questions, right? I still ask questions like, how did Michael Jackson really die? Was it from a drug overdose? Did he really do that to himself? Or was it the system trying to get rid of the guy? Look at a lot of the things that he was doing in the background before his court trial, before they tried to demonize him. Because if he was really the monster that they claim that he was, monsters, they're very habitual. They have patterns, and if he was this monster, he would have been this monster for a very long time, and the evidence for that is just not there, right? It is true, like, he didn't have a childhood. He grew up without having a childhood. He was forced at a very young age to become a young man by his dad, who would literally beat the living shit out of him if he didn't do exactly what his dad wanted him to do and in the manner that he wanted him to do it. So Michael didn't have a childhood, and he really wanted other kids to just be kids, and he's seen that. So what was Michael doing in the background? Also, listen to the music, the lyrics. What was Michael saying in his lyrics? And in a lot of his songs toward the end, He's talking about this very same thing. He's talking about the system, the demons, the control that is hidden in the background, but he can't come out and say it, right? He can't come out because it would basically ruin him and his career overnight. The powers that be, because they're very good at this, right? They've been doing this for a very long time, since Hollywood has been invented, right? That's the whole purpose behind Hollywood, is to make up these fascinating stories, and then we all pay attention to them, right? And for Michael, we did. We turned into his story. We watched the news. We watched the system destroy this person. And think of all the other people that they've done this to. Okay? So, once again, I thank you guys for watching Breaking the System. Think critically. Be a critical thinker, right? Have conversation. Have dialogue. Especially have dialogue with the people that you don't agree with. It's not that you're going to change their mind, and it's not that they're going to change your mind, but it's the idea that America is built on this notion of freedom of speech, and we are free to have dialogue with one another without defaming, without demoralizing one another, without hurting each other, without killing each other. And we really have lost this path, America has. So with that, I thank you, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for tuning in.